Hello, everyone. Welcome to the lecture series of Middle East Studies here at Brown University. And it's our distinct pleasure today to have with us Madar Lavi. Middle East Studies at Brown has taken the opportunity this semester to reflect a bit on the question of Mizrahi Jews in Israel, and specifically the long struggle, often hidden from people's view, of Mizrahi Jews in Israel for equality and for justice. We had a presentation, a very successful one by Ramon Stern as part of our luncheon seminar series. And now we have with us Smadar Lavi, who just published a new book on this topic called Wrapped in the Flag of Israel, Mizrahi Single Mothers and Bureaucratic Torture, which posits a model of state bureaucracy that operates, she claims, by theological decree. It's also an ethnographic, not just study of Mizrahi Jews in Israel, but an autoethnography, as she calls it, detailing her life as a welfare mother and her leadership in Ahoti, if I pronounce it correctly.
أحوتي
Ahoti,
يعني
with a
أختي
ha.
بالعربي.
Okay, بالعربي. Israel's first feminist of color movement, and which really exposes the cultural apartheid between Jews from the Muslim and Arab world, or Mizrahim, who are the majority of citizens in Israel, and the state's European Jewish ruling minority. As you can see on the screen, Professor Lavi is scholar in residence at the Beatrice Bain Research Group in UC Berkeley, and a visiting professor at the Institute of Social Science in the 21st Century at University College, Cork. She received her doctorate in anthropology from University of California, Berkeley, and spent 9 years as a tenured professor of anthropology and critical theory at the University of California, Davis. She specializes in anthropology of Egypt, the state of Israel, and Palestine, with emphasis on issues of race, gender, and religion. The first book I read of hers, which had a big effect on me, is The Poetics of Military Occupation, which I think is a classic in the field, out of UC Press in 1990, which is the year I finished my PhD dissertation, and I remember distinctly reading that book. And it received the 1990 honorable mention of the Victor Turner Award for ethnographic writing. She also co-edited Creativity/Anthropology from Cornell University Press, and Displacement, Diaspora, and Geographies of Identity from Duke University Press. And she won the American Studies Association's 2009 Gloria Anzaldúa
Yeah, Anzaldúa.
Prize for her article, quote, Staying Put, Crossing the Palestine-Israel Border with Gloria Anzaldúa. It was published in Anthropology and Humanism in 2000. And there's many other awards. Please help me in welcoming Smadar Lavi. Did you want to speak from the chair?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, is this okay? I have a loud voice like many Arab women, so.
It's also for the people.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to read my talk. And I think these are terrible times for Palestine and Israel. And I hope that my talk turns some light on the fascist turn in Israeli society, culture, and politics, and its roots actually in socialist Zionism. So on 2nd July 2003, Vicky Knafo, a 43-year-old single mom of 3, started her march on Jerusalem wearing a baseball cap and wrapped in the Israeli flag. Vicky is a Mizrahi. Mizrahim are Jews with origins in the Arab and Muslim world and the margins of the Ottoman Europe, and comprise 50% of the citizenry in the State of Israel. The other two segments of Israel's citizenry are 20% Palestinians with Israeli citizenship and 30% Ashkenazim or European Jews of Yiddish-speaking origins. Ashkenazim control the division of power and privilege in the state. Vicky's 205-kilometer pilgrimage ascended to the capital from Mitzpe Ramon, a remote majority Mizrahi desert town with one of Israel's highest unemployment rates. This is another leader of the march. I learned about Vicky on July 3rd as I perused emails from Ahoti, Israel's feminist of color movement. Ahoti means sister in Hebrew. One detailed Vicky's call to an Ahoti official. I'm marching on Jerusalem for thousands of Israeli single moms. Up to June 29, we were big-time Likudniks and voted for Bibi or Benjamin Netanyahu. He gonna hear from me no more. We sisters joined Vicky, protected her from police who tried to arrest her for blocking traffic, and brought her story to the press. When Vicky appeared on TV, dozens of poverty-stricken single moms from Israel's Mizrahi ghettos started their own marches on Jerusalem. The moms arrived at the capital on July 9, 2003. Over the next few days, hundreds of citizens visited in solidarity. Thus, the welfare moms of Israel gathered on the Rose Park slope facing Government Hill and the Knesset and declared the establishment of Knafoland. Now I'm going to talk about Chok HaHesderim and Knafonomics. Vicky originally marched in protest of a June 29, 2003 amendment to Israel's Chok HaHesderim, or arrangement law in Hebrew, that slashed single moms' welfare allowances. Chok HaHesderim is the Israeli version of Reaganomics, meant to deregulate and downsize government, reduce public spending, decrease upper-class taxation, and ease inflation. It consolidates diverse deregulatory budget cuts into a single annual finance committee-backed amendment for the Knesset to vote into law, usually in the wee hours. Israel middle to lower class single moms are not the same as those in North America or Europe. Most Israeli single moms give birth shortly after marriage. Thus, when they divorce, they have limited work experience. In addition, child support is almost impossible to obtain, thanks to legal precedents favoring deadbeat dads. Some moms can rely on their families for financial assistance. These are almost always ahusals, a Hebrew acronym for Ashkenazi, Heloni or secular, Vatik or old-timer, socialist and liberal. Hebrew slang uses Ashkenazim to mean ahusals, not to be confused with the 90s post-Soviet immigrants. Mizrahi single moms, the majority of single moms, cannot rely on their families for financial support, so they turn to welfare. In June 2003, the National Security Bureau, or NSB, mailed single moms notices about slashing their monthly income assurances, income augmentations, and rent aid. The notices also informed them about the mom's retroactive debt to the NSB incurred between January, when the 2003 amendment entered into law, and June, when enforcement started. Distraught moms packed the line at the NSB and the state bureaus for rent assistance and job placement. Vicky marched because she could no longer pay her bills. Her half-time job paid 1,217 new Israeli shekels, or NIS, about $280 a month. Before the amendment, she received income augmentation of 1,983 NIS, or about $456. The amendment reduced it to 679 NIS, or about $156, an amount swallowed up by her retroactive debt, reducing her welfare to nothing. I too was a single mom on welfare. I was stranded in Israel between 1999 and 2007 when I fled from California to save my son's life. Yet Vicky and I were different. I had access to privilege she didn't have. In the 1948 Nakba, the Ashkenazi Zionist left regime expelled almost all the Palestinians from their homes and lands. In the 50s, the regime Judaized the newly formed State of Israel. It settled new Jewish immigrants from the Arab and Muslim world into the far-flung corners where the exiled Palestinians once lived. For their survival, Vicky's parents were forced into complete reliance on Israel's bureaucratic infrastructure. Unlike Vicky, I benefited from an Ashkenazi father and grew up in a largely Ashkenazi working-to-middle-class neighborhood south of Tel Aviv. My mom's marriage strategy spared me of the intergenerational poverty that had affected her own childhood in a Jerusalem slum. My parents gave me access to superior education Vicky never had. But when Israelis look at me, they detect no trace of my blonde-haired, green-eyed father. My phenotype always trumps my privilege. My biography should not have included an encounter with welfare. I should have arrived in Knafoland as a University of California researcher, but that route had closed. Now I'm going to talk about the Oslo boom time. The 2003 Hok HaHesderim amendment merely contributed to the disenfranchisement of Mizrahi single moms. These severe budget cuts were not supposed to happen after the 1993 Oslo Peace Accord signed by Israel and the Palestinian Authority, or PA. The Israeli peace architects, upper-class Ashkenazi politicians and entrepreneurs, promised an economic boom for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Instead, they worked in concert with the affluent leadership of the PA to break up labor unions and do away with sustained salaried work. Both the Israeli and PA economies were machines of cronyism and monopoly. Investment capital funneled through Israeli entrepreneurs funded enterprises run by Arafat's coterie. Worse, the Israeli and PA leadership ignored their lack of support among the majority of Israelis and Palestinians, the Mizrahim and Islamists. Oslo peace economics made use of outsourcing. Factories in Israel closed and moved to places like Jordan and Honduras, leaving no job for working-class Mizrahim and Palestinian Israelis. The West Bank and Gaza Palestinians were hit by unemployment as well. Israeli employers chose to hire third-world guest workers who were not subject to minimum wage regulations and who were unlikely to participate in anti-Israeli guerrilla actions. The Oslo Accords were concurrent with a huge influx of Ashkenazi post-Soviet immigration. Real estate prices inflated in Israel's center, where a large percentage of Israel's jobs are. Post-Soviets priced out Mizrahi families who thus had one alternative to remain close to work and better schools, the West Bank and Gaza settlements. The unchecked settlement expansion and stillborn PA economy caused civil unrest with the West Bank and Gaza Palestinians. No wonder the second Al-Aqsa Intifada broke out in October 2000. Israeli troops and tanks once again waged war on Palestinian civilians who responded with increased suicide bombing. Public panic penetrated all Israeli society. The Oslo boom time collapsed. Now I'll talk about the Hudna. The Hok HaHesderim amendment took effect on 29 June 2003. The same day, the Israeli government and Hamas declared the Hudna, ceasefire, a temporary respite from the Al-Aqsa Intifada. The Israeli Defense Force, or IDF, pulled back from Palestinian towns and villages. Suicide bombing in Israel stopped. But the Hudna also meant no grand guignol for an anxious foreign press corps. So when the Israeli media glommed onto Knafoland, the foreign press followed. So now I'm going to take you through the argument of my book. And I call it Protesting and Belonging, when the agency of identity politics becomes impossible. Because the Israeli regime always already has a web of bureaucratic entanglements to preempt civil disobedience, the Knafo protest, like all Mizrahi protests, was doomed to fail. My book discusses this failure and the ways I choose to ethnograph it through a 6-part processual argument. The State of Israel identifies itself as a Jewish state and a homeland for all world Jewry. Jews religiously conceive themselves as the chosen people, and their religiously conceived chosen land is Eretz Israel, or historic Palestine. This conundrum makes the agency immanent in identity politics impossible to enact. So part 1 of my argument has to do with the Israel-Palestine binary. The global public typically knows Israel through the 2 dominant binarisms available for international public consumption. One is that of the Jewish state versus Arab neighboring states, who are its enemies. The other is the Israel-Palestine conflict. The only way that the Israeli state might change its policies is through pressure by the international community. This pressure is more likely with US-European mainstream media exposure of the Israeli regime's indelicacies. Much of the Israeli media, however, is controlled by the Ashkenazi elite. Much of the US European media is controlled by a pro-Israel lobby. They work in concert to cover the Israeli-Palestinian binary, excluding other newsworthy stories. Inside Israel, however, the Hebrew media does narrate stories such as the Knafo protest, but only as isolated freak shows. These stories never cohere into a statement about structural intra-Jewish apartheid. International media largely ignore these stories, and thus Israel's Mizrahi majority. Part 2 of my argument deals with the Ashkenazi minority mainstream. Mizrahi social protest movements are not typical minority resistance movements. The ruling Ashkenazi minority has disenfranchised Israel's demographic majority as it dictates Israel's mainstream. A racialized, minoritized majority, Mizrahim strive to enter the Ashkenazi mainstream for improved housing, schools, jobs, and healthcare. Mizrahi activists refer to mainstream Mizrahi leaders who deny and thus refuse to hear about intra-Jewish race relations as suffering Mizrahi Capo syndrome. For the sake of intra-Jewish unity, the raison d'etre of the Jewish state survival in Palestine, the Ashkenazi mainstream and its Mizrahi capos judge anyone speaking about intra-Jewish race relations guilty of lehit bachyen, meaning whining and being a crybaby in Hebrew. The third part of my argument deals with bureaucratic logic and how it denies majoritarian agency. United with the Ashkenazim as chosen people, Mizrahim insist on protecting their Jewish refuge from the Goyim, or enemies in colloquial Hebrew. Thus, the Mizrahim and Ashkenazim together recast themselves as the unified last defense for the Jewish chosen land, an ethno-religious state formation, Israel. Any possibility of Mizrahi majoritarian agency is ruthlessly dominated by and edited through the logic of bureaucratic categories. Don Hendelman posits a model of the logic underlying state bureaucratic ideology in operation. He digs into the logic underneath Foucault's panopticon, a Turnerian ritual process that mediates the interplay between obedient ethno-religious citizenship and chauvinistic ethno-religious nationhood. The interplay transcends their conjuncture into communitas. Hendelman, therefore, returns to classificatory schemes that crystallize into a Durkheimian collective mind devoid of agency. These schemes cohere into the social organism that functions on the constrictive grid of organic and mechanic solidarity with no time or space for agency. Hendelman thus challenges Max Weber's model of rational secular bureaucracy and argues that it is instead a divine cosmology. The state bureaucracy continuously adjusts its screws to impede the maneuvers of resistive and identity politics. Thus, Mizrahi social movements tend to be short-lived and lead to no lasting change. The regime uses the mirage of Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jewish unity against all Goyim to mask how it uses bureaucracy to crush, marginalize, contain, and buy out individuals or groups within social protest movements. This denies Mizrahim the identity politics normally actionable by legally recognized minorities. The fourth part of my argument is called Love Thy Country, Gender and Race Wrapped in the Flag. Mizrahi protesters cannot break the bonds connecting their love for the Jewish state with the somatic pain inflicted upon them by the state's bureaucracy. Contrary to the Jewish unity of the chosen people, Israeli bureaucratic logic does differentiate between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. Gender and race are part of Renato Rosaldo's model of culture as busy intersection. Jasper Puar argues that the intersectionality model ought to be treated as a nomadic assemblage, but a Mizrahi single mom marching on Jerusalem wrapped in the flag reifies the intersection as an essence, or what I call in one word, gender race. The amalgamation of gender and race that calcifies into primordial truism prohibiting identity politics. Among Israeli Jews, race and class completely overlap. Gender race thus does not obscure the mechanisms of Israeli intra-Jewish class discrimination. Indeed, gender race is the key criterion used by Israeli bureaucratic logic to select its victims. Gender race racializes the state's Mizrahi Jewish demographic majority into a disenfranchised minority. Moreover, the Israeli regime normalizes gender race into transparency. It uses the chosen people, chosen land divine decree to enact and simultaneously deny this transparent gender race essence. Even though a Mizrahi single mom moves through times and space, she can only move through the time and space allotted by the regime. Because she loves her Jewish homeland and fears that a genuine intersectional resistance will weaken her homeland's stand against the Goyim, she can enact only a simulacrum of resistance. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip the last two parts of the argument. The fifth part has to do with my use of the world anthropology's paradigm for my ethnography. This is a paradigm that is used mainly theoretically and as a practice by anthropologists working from the global south. And part 6 has to do with Audre Lorde's use of anger in academic texts. So let me now take you through the journey that will explain the gender race essence of bureaucratic logic. So first, I'm going to talk about classificatory schemes of bureaucratic logic. Underneath the Knafo protest is a bureaucracy whose role is to assist impoverished Mizrahi single moms meet daily needs. Handelman argues that the bureaucracy's categories are liminal time spaces governed by the same singular logic that governs ritual processes. In the bureaucracy I lived through and studied, the abstractness of Handelman's scheme is reified by officials, clerks, and long lines of subjects dependent on these schemes for survival. Urban daily life in Israel fit into the Jamesonian model of late capitalism on its flexible regime of accumulation. Unlike Roseldo's busy intersection, Israeli bureaucratic logic does not come with postmodernist flows and fluxes. Rather, it is monothetic, each scheme based on one classificatory criterion. The liminal time spaces of Israel's welfare bureaucracy are populated by two types of participants. The first is a bureaucrat. At low level, bureaucrats are usually Mizrahim, often women, since the pay is low. Only when climbing upward in the hierarchy do Ashkenazi bureaucrats appear. The second type of participant is the subject. In my ethnography, a single mom. She rushes from bureau to bureau, waiting in long lines every time. When she steps through the limen into the bureau time space, she attempts to accomplish certain linear goals, narrow in scope and vital to survival, obtaining income assurance, job referrals, and food stamps. If her goal is not accomplished, she must keep returning and returning day after day until the goal is accomplished and a cyclical interval for her visits is established. Once a week, twice a month. But this modicum of stability is deceptive, as arbitrarily imposed changes to bureau regulations can disrupt the cycle, once again requiring her to visit the bureau daily until she can re-establish a new routine. In any case, the mom will return to perform her suffering in front of the bureaucrat. She thus enacts Mircea Eliade's myth of eternal return. Government bureaus are the sites of her repeated sacred pilgrimage. Now I'll talk about negative communitas, or bureaucracy's tough love. To survive, the single mom must traverse through many liminal time spaces inside the state's welfare bureaucracy. Handelman identifies the architecture of these time spaces into the linear tracks of two systems, vertical and horizontal. A vertical system is a straight up and down hierarchy of officials and clerks in a specific bureau. A horizontal system is the arrangement in space of neatly compartmentalized vertical systems in the wider governmental landscape. Thus, a single mom's most important tool in slogging through bureaucracy is her ability to taxonomize in accordance with bureaucratic logic. Each vertical system has its own independent procedural logic that dictates the action of the bureaucrats within it. Any exception placed forward by a single mom is seen as an anomaly and therefore a disruption. A Levi-Straussian deep structure onto itself, Bureaucracy is totalistic, entailing its own transformation and self-regulation. Handelman mentions but does not problematize the theological decree underpinning secular Ashkenazi Zionism, the chosen people living in the chosen land. The biblical Holy Land is Palestine, and the chosen people came from Europe to colonize it, informed by fin de siècle ethics of eugenic superiority, documented by Folk and Storling Lees, among others. Chosen people and chosen land are totalistic fictions that belong in Zionism's non-negotiable divine order. After the Nakba, the Ashkenazim found themselves a European minority in the middle of the Arab world. To justify their claim to a Jewish homeland and bolster their Jewish demographics, they engineered a mass migration of Jews from the Arab world. Chosen people, chosen land is a cosmological principle superimposed upon Mizrahim, who willingly accept it as an axiom. Most often, ceremonial ritual liminality leads to communitas, resulting in positive catharsis. But, crushed by the system, Mizrahi single moms can only obtain what E.D. Turner termed negative communitas. The moms may achieve catharsis by progressing from line to line to line to accomplish small goals like reconnecting electricity and water, but the relief is fleeting. Handelman outlines how the Israeli regime controls its citizens via the torquing relationship between the national emotional chosen people, chosen land, and the regime's bureaucratic grip on every facet of citizens' lives. I posit that his argument is limited to the subaltern citizens of the state. The Mizrahi majority and Palestinian minority citizens of Israel must submit to the tough love of state bureaucracy to get welfare. The Palestinians do not buy into the illusion of tough love and have thus organized to claim their minority rights. For the Mizrahi victims of bureaucracy, love for the Jewish nation hampers efficient organization and actions for social change to redeem their citizens' rights. This love for and dependency on the state prevents Mizrahi single moms from speaking about the pain they suffer from bureaucracy. Yet the pain is present and wears down the strength of those who suffer it. Because the torture is elusive, there is no remedy. While at the University of California, I focused on the Arab-Israeli border zone and the hybridity and tactical essentialism at the intersectional crux of Mizrahi identity politics. Ted Swedenborg and I argued that agency sparks up at the border zone where identity and place grate up against each other and are forced into constantly shifting configurations of partial overlap. But when in front of any welfare bureaucrat, I couldn't state that I existed at the intersection of my identities as a former UC professor, single mom, repatriated citizen from hip Berkeley, Mizrahi identified with an Ashkenazi father, anti-Zionist, and semi-observant Jew. The bureaucrat would eject me from the office. To him, I was just another Yemeni welfare mama. There are no border zones in Israel's bureaucratic logic and thus no agency. As Grace Cho writes, without agency, a mom's trauma is the essential unspeakable, transmitted non-discursively from one generation to the next. I'm going to skip the part that I talk about the plus-minus model of pain. Basically, usually when you study torture, be it a state crime or torture against political detainees or relationship between a rapist and a raped woman, it's a plus-minus relationship. Everyone knows who is a torturer and who is being tortured. And then it's very easy to transform the physical experience of the pain into narrative if we go to John Scott, Evidence of Experience, or Elaine Scarry, The Body in Pain. I'm talking about phenomena that basically are challenging John Scott, Evidence of Experience, or Scarry's model for torture and pain, and I call it the zone of repulsion, or plus-plus relationships of pain. Scholarship on torture does not designate bureaucracy as a possible inflictor. As well, scholarship on bureaucracy doesn't discuss the somatization of bureaucratic logic into torture. It is the application of bureaucratic logic that prevents Mizrahi single moms from completing Scari's recipe for mimetic redemption. She said, well, we go through certain stages from the physical experience of the torture until we're going to express it, usually through mimesis, through art, theater, which is rehabilitating experience for the tortured. When you are surviving bureaucratic torture, you cannot go through what I call in the book the Eileen Scari's cycle or recipe for redemption. Bureaucratic logic throws asunder the plus-minus relationship between inflictor and inflicted and creates what Nigel Thrift dubbed non-representational experiences. The bureaucrat or the inflictor and the dependent single mom or the inflicted share a plus-plus relationship. The bureaucrat is unaware of the infliction of pain because he or she is there to assist the single mom to accomplish her goals. The single mom cannot objectify the torture because she comes to the bureau searching for the solace of practical solutions. Like the positive poles of two magnets, the bureaucrat and single mom enter an encounter only to repel each other. Therefore, their pre-discursive reality cannot develop into discourse. Without discourse, there is no transformation of lived experience into Miktosig's mimetic faculty, the ability of the primitivized other to produce and reproduce tactile experiences as stories of resistance against the US European colonizer. Thus, no catharsis and no time-space for agency. The bureaucrat must assist a single mom achieve deliverance. Ostensibly, they share the same monothetic goals. But with the application of bureaucratic logic, the ability of the bureaucrat to offer deliverance becomes indeterminate. The bureaucrat may not be able to give her a welfare check, the very reason she was in the lines, because the NSB sent it to the wrong bureau. Or the bureau's computer assigned her to attend a job interview on what turned out to be a public holiday. When the bureaucrat is unable to give or willfully denies the mom what she needs, the bureaucrat becomes the administrator of torture. At the same time, the bureaucrat is convinced that all of her or his actions are in the service of the mom. A single mother is subject to torture even if she obtains deliverance from the bureaucrat. Standing in multiple lines is physically exhausting and humiliating. When she finally has her bureaucratic encounter, she must speak narrowly about the issue at hand. The bureaucrat will not tolerate any lack of monothetic focus. Because the mom needs the deliverance only the bureaucrat can offer, she has no recourse but to brave this liminal repulsion zone again and again to accomplish daily survival goals. The bureaucratic encounter is self-perpetuating ritual process where the bureaucrat unwittingly abuses the mom. It repeats ad infinitum. The bureaucrat and mom lack awareness of their inflicting-inflicted relationship because the repulsion zone is a reification of the gap in linear bureaucratic logic. The single mom lives shrouded in a constant state of anxiety, but she cannot draw a direct line to the Israeli state as ultimate victimizer. Handelman notes how the Israeli state transposition of frustration amputates the mom's organic relationships with family, kin, neighbors, and friends. The lines rob her of time with loved ones and replace it with constant competition with the moms of the lines for the state's scraps. Despite these traumas, she still allies herself with the state through Durkheim's mechanical solidarity. Mailed official documents, such as the ones that inform the single moms of their slashed NSB allowances, can also trigger this pain domino effect. For the sake of time, I will not go into detail today on how just getting a document from the NSB in the mail start this whole kind of traumatic response without the woman understanding that the state, she's victimized by the state, because how could a Jewish state victimize a Jewish mother if we are all united against the Goyim? Now let me talk about bureaucracy's essence, or what I term gender race, one word. The underlying principle of the bureaucratic encounter is the phenomenological essence of gender race. Gender race is comprised of the Husserlian noesis noema complementary binary that constructs the essence. Noesis is the conscious process of experiencing, perceiving, and directing attention, while noema is the essence experienced, directed to, and thought about. A Zionist card carrier, the single mom, is not aware of this essence even though she embodies it. The lower-level bureaucrat, often Mizrahi and a Zionist card carrier, is also unaware of this gender race essence. The bureaucrat is also unaware of the meaning imbued upon the essence through actions on behalf of the mom. The meaning, however, is paradoxically dictated by this very gender race essence located at the foundation underneath the binary deep structure of Zionism, a paternalistic colonialist logic of androcentric European superiority versus effeminate Arab inferiority cited by Ella Shohat. Democratic systems of governance assume gender and race neutrality. Paul Gilroy and Suad Joseph, however, argue that gender and race are actually the most important categorical principles sorting citizens. One becomes a citizen either through birth or a process of naturalization, that is, having citizenship as one's nature rather than culture. Race and gender hierarchize citizens through the fiction of equal rights propped up by corrective legislation. Not so in Israel. The Israeli regime assumes gender and race neutrality. Yet any immigrant, whether Mizrahi or Ashkenazi, can become an instant citizen of the chosen land by tracing a 3 to 5 generation lineage of Jewish moms, proving he or she belonged to the chosen people. Because a state will never admit its own intra-Jewish racial formation, there is no affirmative action legislation that rectifies injustices against the Mizrahim. In the Jewish state, all Jews are supposed to be equal. From early Zionism on, the chosen Jewish race was European. This was held as an axiom. As documented by Stoller Lis, only secular European Jewish women were eugenically capable of reproducing pure citizens. The calcified amalgamation of gender and race in Israel of the 21st century is beyond construction. Gender race is what makes a nation tick and stick. When asked about the racial formations of Israel, most disenfranchised Mizrahim would say in one breath, Zionism is Ashkenazi racism. But they also vehemently support the idea and practices of a Jewish state and are therefore Zionists. For the sake of Zionism, they bracket the discrimination they suffer in favor of a phantom deracinated citizenship. I'm going to skip now on the whole way that the Mizrahi body is structured according to the Nordic ideas of beauty, which are prevalent in Israel, and the way that, the difficult and complex intersection of Mizrahi women, when this is the way they need to strive to look like. So all of these racial gender assumptions are culturally learned constructions. Zionism's eugenic legacy, however, has calcified them into natural genetic decrees that have cohered into non-negotiable essence, gender race. The gender race essence and the chosen people, chosen land divine decree work together while simultaneously contradicting each other. Chosen people, chosen land demands a unilateral Jewish front against the Goyim. But this unity is frail because at its core is an essence of racial and gender difference. This is why chosen people, chosen land is evoked every time gender race surfaces into everyday life. Chosen people, chosen land pushes gender race back into its invisible foundational modality that allows the state's bureaucratic logic to function as a mechanism of oppression. Despite the feminist injunction against binary logic, let alone the calcified amalgamation of binary logic into an essence, the women in the lines reify gender race. For disenfranchised Mizrahi single moms, gender race becomes both the main principle for their bureaucratic classification and source of their unarticulated torture. So now I'm going to skip a whole part because of time on the whole phenomenological bracketing process, where I follow both Husserl and Sarah Ahmed, Queer Phenomenology, as I discuss how Mizrahi women manage to deal with all of this torture and still be loyal citizens. And I'm also going to skip the whole part on how you write about it when you yourself become your own informant. It's not that I had a home, university home to resort to, but I was a welfare mother myself. So it's all spelled out in my book, the methodology of doing world anthropology and also combining it with Gloria Anzaldua's autoethnographia. Basically, in short, I wrote in multiple genres, and I took Geertz and kind of like politicized him because I tried to ignore his depoliticized detritus right when Indonesia went through such an upheaval. And I didn't overlook the fact that he had a home base in Chicago when he wrote The Interpretation of Cultures, while my home base was my body. But I think that thick description is a good methodology when you work with texts from the field to interpret the language to your readers, because there are lots of code words, as I will show now. So I want to read you a journal excerpt dated July 21st, 2003, and how I use Goethe's thick description. I politicize it, but I call it my translation machine to culturally translate an official letter that I mailed the NSB. I must reply to the letter of Esther Rabinovich. What a classical Eastern European last name, who heads the Service for Income Assurance and Augmentation at the NSB Tel Aviv branch. I must defer to her by using the official style language that she herself uses, including the vestiges of Israel's socialist era when comrades were addressed last name first. To the Honorable Rabinovich Esther, claim clerk. She used the Hebrew masculine for clerk. The National Security Bureau, the Service for Income Assurance and Augmentation, regarding your July 15, 2003 letter. Dear Ms. Rabinovich, your 5 July letter postmarked July 16 arrived July 20th. Enclosed is a copy marked Exhibit 1. I would like to call your attention to the following. 1. Your letter states that I am entitled to receive income augmentation totaling 447 NIS. Yesterday, I spent half an hour with Miss Davidi, the dedicated clerk at the post office branch on Ibn Gabirol Street. In goodwill, she spent nearly an hour on the phone traversing the post office bank hierarchy to track down the missing augmentation. Now, the Geertz translation machine. Why was I at the post office rather than the NSB? Around the first of every month, the NSB paid out income assurances or augmentations in one or two ways. The first was by issuing a physical check for a welfare recipient to pick up at the NSB. In the second, the NSB deposited money directly into an Israeli post office bank account. The recipient would present a stamp to an NSB claim clerk, who then clears her monthly allotment with the post office bank. To withdraw the funds, the recipient shows her ID to a post office clerk. Oftentimes, a single mom with her children on the bus might get to the post office to be told that there is no money in her name and that her check is probably at the NSB. After surviving the NSB lines, the check dispensing clerk may announce, "No checks, go back to the post office." This runaround can last up to 3 weeks. Since rent is always due in the first of the month, she might return home to find a 7-day eviction notice to her door, on her door. And back to the letter. She told me that there was no sum of money in my name. Because of my repeated appeals to your office, I'm urgently requesting you to personally investigate the fund's disappearance, too. As for your assertions raised in your letters, quote, your phone appeal was full of racist remarks bordering on insulting a public servant, and in the future such an appeal will not be answered, end quote. Please permit me to respond as follows. The way you addressed me was unconcerned, patronizing, and full of false accusations about me and all single moms. And now to the cultural translation. Rabinovich's assertion were that all single moms spend tax money to bleach their hair blonde, get manicures and pedicures, and smoke imported cigarettes. Further, they eagerly open their legs to financially exploit men and remain on the dole by failing to report their additional income. This is how the Israeli public views single moms. Returning to his letter. These have nothing to do with my specific request for you to track down my missing income augmentation. 3. Considering item 1 and 2 of this letter, and in light of our phone and written communication, non-Orientals are also capable of exaggeration and emotionality. Perhaps the definition of Dimyon Mizrahi, or Oriental imagination, in Hebrew should be revised. Babach Smadar Lavi. Babach is an acronym for Bebirkat Chaverim, Hebrew, or with a blessing of the comrades. This is exactly how she signed her letter. Like many Israelis, I CC'd the ombudsman of the State Controller Bureau, who was supposed to look out for the little guy. My only alternative, a competent attorney, lay outside my economic universe. My son calculated our finances in increments of milk. Since our weekly NGO food donations did not include milk, it was one of our main food expenditures. An attorney with any prayer of winning would have cost at least 1,200 cups of milk an hour. And next, I have two ethnographic excerpts from the final chapter of the book. The Knafo struggle ended the next day. On the evening of August 19, 2003, a Palestinian suicide bomber dressed as an Orthodox Jew carried a bomb aboard bus number 2 from the Western Wall into Jewish Jerusalem. The bomb detonated just past Peace Road number 1, the old 67 border between Palestinian Jerusalem and Mizrahi Jerusalem. 23 people died. Over 130 were injured. Most of the casualties were ultra-Orthodox Jews. One Filipina domestic worker also died. This ended the hudna between Israel and the Hamas. Before the bombing, the media whiled away the uneventful day of the hudna in their own encampment near Knafeland. When their Motorola's buzzed with news of the bombing, they all leapt up. In a press corps caravan, they sped across town to cover the carnage. After, they went to the American Colony Hotel bar to get drunk. Without media coverage, the socialites, or social worker caseworkers, took advantage. They offered the moms minimal incentives to leave and reminded them that if their children were not in school come September, they'd be ordered into forced boarding by the Youth and Family Court. The plight of the single moms was completely off the public agenda, in favor of the Palestine-Israel conflict. The moms left the encampment within a few days of the bombing. For Jewish New Year 2004, Vicky Knafo, strapped for cash, posed nude for an Israeli porn website. For this photo op, she had written on her breasts, "The state milks single mothers." Later, she sued the owners of the site because they didn't pay her what they promised. On the eve of Jewish New Year 2005, Vicky's son committed suicide. Right after Jewish New Year 2006, Vicky joined the Meretz party of the bourgeois Ashkenazi left and started giving speeches about peace. Shortly thereafter, she disappeared from the public sphere. Second excerpt from the final chapter. On February 21, 2005, I attended a convening of the Israeli Women's Parliament. One speaker was Dr. Linda Efroni, a brilliant Iraqi economist and labor attorney. She is a prominent consultant for Israel's major unions and a member of the Israeli Council of Higher Education. In the discussion, she told the following story. Around 2001, I was invited by the Israeli College of National Security, where military officers are groomed to become generals, to give a lecture at Haifa University. The audience was made up of students in the special program, but also senior members of the Shabak, or Israel's FBI, military intelligence, the Israeli police force, and other senior officials in the national security apparatus. This was around the time of the social unrest following the collapse of the Argentinian economy. They wanted to know if similar unrest was possible in Israel. I offered my analysis. We have problems with security and with borders. These transcend socioeconomic protests. It would take nothing less than a miracle for any social protest to succeed. If social unrest appeared in the news, I would not be surprised to hear about Hezbollah Katyusha's rockets falling on Kiryat Shmona the next day. This would immediately shift public discourse back to security. I couldn't rule out that the Katyushas on Kiryat Shmona were a response to an IDF Air Force provocation of their fighter jets crossing the border deep into Lebanon. Everyone was quiet. Everyone was quiet, no one said a thing. And then we broke for a buffet lunch. At the buffet, a corpulent man approached me. He said, "Shalom, my name is B. I used to be the media advisor for the Minister of Defense, and this is exactly what we did. On October 9, 2010, I called Dr. Efroni from Minneapolis to verify the quote. She said, yes, this is exactly what I said, and this is what he said. He didn't say that it was off the record. As for Vicky and the end of the Hudna, I was in a meeting with Bibi in Jerusalem. She wanted me to join her. The man was very stressed. He sweated a lot, very stressed. In hindsight, even in the finance ministry, they didn't believe it was going to be so easy. Hok HaEsderim nullifies out the legislator. Israel is not a democracy. In the 2003 amendment, they saved 5 billion NIS. They transferred the money to the upper echelons in the form of a tax refund. They could have done other things with the money. They were so surprised at how easy the transfer was. I think it's not impossible that they let the suicide bomber slip through. And the last is an excerpt from the book's epilogue. It's a coda that relates the Knafo struggle with the Israeli protest of summer 2011. In summer 2011, tens of thousands of young Israelis priced out of the rental leases or foreclosed upon protested the state's slashing of public services, echoing the single mom's protest of 2003, but on a larger scale. The protesters referred to this as Tel Aviv Tahrir after the Tahrir Square demonstrations in Cairo that toppled the Mubarak regime. Unlike in the Knafo protest, the leaders and spokespeople of Summer 11 were Zionist left Ashkenazim, even though young Mizrahim composed the majority of the protesters, reflecting Israel's demographics. Most of the protest's leadership were single, from affluent families, and received preferential treatment from the authorities. Thus, the regime could not threaten them with forced boarding of their children due to poverty. Palestinian citizens of Israel have largely avoided participation. Most criticized the protests for not clearly addressing the connections between Israel's economic troubles and the cost of the military occupation and West Bank settlements. The protest leadership's strategy was to avoid any mention of Palestine, to reach consensus between all sectors of Israel's secular and religiously observant majority Jewish citizenry. Thanks to a lull in the Israel-Palestine conflict in summer 2011, the protest got international media attention. On August 18, 2011, a suicide attack by Sinai Bedouin guerrilla struck an Israeli bus. The IDF responded by bombarding Palestinian civilians in Gaza. In turn, Hamas bombarded civilian populations in Israel's south. The Israeli regime used this attack to divert attention from the protest. Major Hebrew media outlets have reported that Shabak and the IDF both had intelligence on the date, time, and place of the bombing. Netanyahu instructed them to shut up when the Knesset inquired about the lack of preventive measures. At the January 27, 2012 dinner for the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland, Israeli Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defense Ehud Barak delivered a speech on the prospects of an Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. In the same speech, he referred to the social protest. If the government will not respond to the protest, it will return with force and violence. The fact that these two subjects appeared side by side in Barak's speech has gone unnoticed by the international media. Hebrew media analysts predicted possible reasons that may serve to end Israel's Jewish social unrest. One may be an IDF military attack on Iran. In the preface for the new edition, I write on how the Iran-US deal kind of deflated Netanyahu rhetoric on attacking Iran. Another may be military response to Palestinian uprising, resulting from another unsuccessful US-UN attempt to declare an independent Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza. This is happening exactly these days. In any case, a conflict that unites all Israeli Jews will serve to end any social unrest, the same way that a timely suicide bomb ended the summer 2003 Knafo protest. Thank you.
Please, the floor is open for questions. So maybe I'll start.
Sure.
All incoming students at Brown had to read a book as part of their orientation to Brown about the incarceration rates among African Americans and how it constitutes, in many ways, a continuation of a systemic oppression from slavery to Jim Crow to now. And a core theme of the book was how an alliance between African Americans and poor whites had emerged in several key junctures and caused not a small amount of panic in the governing circles in this country, and all sorts of methods they resorted to in order to break up a possible combination. And I'm wondering if that is a literature you've looked at for this book, and if there are, what are the similarities and differences between these two stories?
My book, like Mizrahi feminism, take lots of inspiration from feminism of color here, and also Black British feminism. I can tell you that the Black Panthers of Jerusalem started being taken seriously after they met the Birzeit student union leaders and made a coalition with anti-Zionist Ashkenazim, many of whom ended up in London in like self-imposed political exile. This is a time, I mean, until then, Golda Meir used to call them lo nechmadim, not cute. After they started branching to international movements, mainly post-1968 movements, that's when the police had snipers who shot them from close range. That's when one of the Panthers disappeared, Dani Sa'il. That's where the passport of Reuven Abargil, who was the ideologue of the Black Panthers, was taken right when he was to go with a translator, since he has only 3 years of elementary school education. He was to go and meet with Red Dani and other figures of post-68 resistance in Europe. And after they met with the leadership of students in Birzeit, he was without a passport for 27 years. So this is very, a possibility of Palestinian Mizrahi coalition has been very, very threatening to the regime. But it has nothing to worry, because in Israel, Palestinianness is considered part of Ashkenazi privilege. Most of the pro-Palestine activism is done in English. You have to go to a good school to study English. Schools like in this country are being budgeted per the taxes you pay to the city. So rich neighborhoods have better schools because they pay more taxes. And then pro-Palestine activism is part of this universal human rights agenda that is concentrated in US and Europe. Basically, many Mizrahim laugh about our Ashkenazim going to talk with the Ashkenazim of Ramallah in nice resorts in Europe to kind of talk about peace, coexistence, dialogue, while our publics are turning more and more fascist. So the regime has done very well, as I outline in my book, to socialize Mizrahim against their own background, against their history, and so forth. So they are uber Israelis. So such a coalition is not likely to happen. And the regime also took extreme measures against Mizrahi intellectuals of the anti-Zionist variety, such as myself and others, which I outline in my book, because for us to be active with our communities, we strategically keep silent about our Palestine politics, though everyone knows. And even then, the regime gives us problems, as far as academic freedom, as far as freedom of employment, like Reuven Abargil is prevented from any kind of gainful employment in Israel. because he wouldn't budge. Because you either sell out or they run after you, or they jail you for long periods of time. Like one of the Israeli quote-unquote spy nets had a Mizrahi, an Iraqi Mizrahi, and the head of the spy net is nowadays a professor. He's a kibbutznik. He's a professor at Israel's Open University with lots of privileges. He wasn't beaten up as harshly, and he wasn't tortured physically by the interrogators. Like the Iraqi member of the spy, they were all jailed, but the Iraqi member was abused, and no one allowed him to study while he was in jail. So you're right as far as the potential of this kind of coalition. Presently, it's not likely to happen because most of the Mizrahi intellectuals are outside Israel. There is a new renaissance of a younger generation of Mizrahim who talk freely about Israeli inter-Jewish racism. They don't talk about Palestine because then they will not have constituencies. And without constituencies, you cannot run a movement. The Mizrahi public, in the meanwhile, is the same people who I write about who wrap themselves in the flag and go and shout death to the Arabs, even though this is the very public that populate the jails. All the while, the Ashkenazi pro-Palestine demonstrators, and I call them in my book, we call them in Mizrahi lingo the 250, because it's usually the same 250 people. And I track them down. They mainly live in very affluent neighborhoods, and they're almost always Ashkenazim, and I really respect their going and demonstrating, but they do it in English for the foreign media. And it's a very, very Machiavellian. That's how they get money to their NGOs, and they build whole careers on it, while they have no impact in Israel as far as advocating for Palestine. So it's a very complicated situation. I hope I answered your question.
More than enough. I
Yeah.
think. Any other questions?
Yes.
Hi. So, can you talk a
Will
little?
you introduce yourself?
Yeah. My name is Blake. I'm a Mizrahi. Mizrahi is the same as Sephardic, right?
There is a difference. Mizrahi is a political term. It's a
Okay.
term of coalition politics, uniting Jews who come from non-Yiddish speaking countries. And Sephardic is a liturgical term. It's a certain way of prayer.
Okay.
So,
I use them interchangeably.
yeah.
So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the origins of the situation now and why, for example, when you look at the Jewish Nobel Prize laureates, they're all Ashkenazi Jews.
Wrong. There are many Mizrahim. They just, Israel doesn't wag them.
Oh.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, do you think it's because of like cultural differences between Europe and the Arab world in which Jews
Yeah.
past generations had grown up in, or like what are the origins, the cultural, ideological origins of
Mizrahim were degenerated in Israel, and studies of, let's say, family members, say, of Moroccans, some who immigrate, or Iraqis, the ones who immigrated to London or Paris, are college educated, many in professions like physicians, surgeons, professors, and actually there is a Mizrahi poet, his name is Moise Ben Harouche, and he has done a counting of how many Mizrahim got Nobel versus how many Ashkenazim. More Mizrahim got Nobels, but they were not a part of the Israeli academic apparatus. Because in Israel, I remember how many troubles I had when I wanted to study anthropology. And I had to fight to get admitted to this profession, which is completely unapplied, because it's almost 100% Ashkenazi. In my book, I tracked down the roots of this kind of settler racism to 1882. And I'm deploying a concept by ethnographer Scott Atran called surrogate colonialism. When the Jews from Europe started colonizing Palestine, they needed to show that they have a raison d'etre being there. I mean, to my mind, I think they have been used as creating, and that's why the Balfour Declaration was given, as creating some sort of a divide, because this was like the end of the, I mean, Bishara can analyze it better than me as a historian. I'm an ethnographer of the here and now, but this was like the end of the Ottoman Empire, and the British didn't want a Muslim continuum between Iraq and North Africa. So having a little European outpost of Eastern European Jews seemed like a good idea. Now then they needed to justify their colonization of Palestine. So the British used Palestinian labor. They needed to have a claim that they are autarkic or self-sufficient. So they actually brought their own labor. They used an economic crisis in South Arabia, and they brought Yemeni workers since 1882 to show that they have their own workers. And actually, historical documents show that they treated the Yemenis worse than they treated the Palestinians, because the Palestinians who worked for them knew the know-hows, and they were go-between. The Yemeni Jews were not allowed to live with the Ashkenazi Jews. For many years, they were not allowed even to build permanent buildings. They lived in huts, or sometimes they put them in the cowshed or with mules. They were hit physically when they worked in the orange groves. And only in 1922, when they had a big strike and refused to work, they were allowed to unionize. But still, they were not allowed to become members of the Histadrut, which was Palestine and then Israel's labor union. So mainly Mizrahim were brought for labor. Part of my inspiration from Chicana feminism comes from the fact that Latinos came to this country also as agricultural workers. And they came from many Spanish dialect-speaking countries and crossed a border. And Mizrahim also came from, first, I mean, Yavni Eli went and he picked up Yemenis, and if you read his diaries, which were published as the book, I mean, it's very much resembles like slave traders, because it doesn't talk about, to these Jews, he talk about Messianism and that the Messiah came, and the Zionist Jews from Europe are helping the Messiah. I mean, he called it like pangs of deliverance. There are pangs of deliverance, which is a Judaic notion of Jewish mysticism, that pangs of deliverance are occurring in Palestine as it being rebuilt as a Jewish state. But then he goes back to where he stays and he talks about gum disease, muscle density. He had problems with the fact that many Yemenis were very short, but he likes the fact that they are frugal, so they will not cost their employer much as far as their employers are feeding them. And so this is like when Mizrahim vote for the right, they're basically vote against socialist Zionism. And it was socialist Zionism that until 1977, when Menachem Begin was elected, commanded the scene. So it's not only voting for their homes in, quote-unquote, the perfect project renewals, which is the settlements, the West Bank settlements, but it's also vote to remedy a historical wound that was inflicted upon them by Ashkenazi socialist Zionism. So the roots go all the way back to 1882, or the first, and that's a concept that Scott Atran calls surrogate colonialism. It's like the Zionists were like surrogate colonizers on top of the British. Oh, I'm sorry, turn this off. And therefore, they brought their own labor with them. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing your work. I wanted to ask about the Mizrahim. Is there, like sometimes we hear, I mean, I know that when they were brought from the various Arab countries, you know, there's a lot of either performance of or discourse around how terrible those places were where they came
Yeah.
from. But I'm wondering if part of the movement is trying to reestablish connections to, say, Yemen or Egypt or Morocco or whatever.
Yes and no. There is now a big Moroccan renaissance in Israel. And Moroccan Mizrahim go back to Morocco. There are also real estate developers who are Moroccan Israelis who build apartment buildings in Morocco. Same way that there are real estate Israeli financiers also go and build buildings like in Romania and Bulgaria, so or in the Dominican Republic.
Wait, for what purpose?
For money.
Oh, as a business?
Yeah, as a business, as a development business, like getting into the housing market. However, this is a ploy that Israel uses to kind of like show diversity. For example, every year in Poland, and Polish are very, very careful in their criticism of Israel because of the number of Polish Jews who were exterminated in the Holocaust. There is an international music festival and a Jewish music festival. And 2 years ago, the guests of honor, there was a beautiful Moroccan singer by the name of Neta El Kayam and her band, who is like reviving traditional Moroccan music, like Baladi music. And last year it was a group of 3 Yemeni sisters called Awa, because much of the Yemeni dancing, like the refrain would say Ahawa, Ahawa, Ahawa. So there is this kind of like pop group of 3 Yemeni sisters. They were the featured group. And this is the way that Israel uses to deflect arguments of, I mean, it's part of Hasbara. Israel has a ministry of Hasbara, which is propaganda. And part of the Hasbara to deflect the racial formation of intra-Jewish racism is to send Israeli artists of Mizrahi variety abroad to show that the ethnic gap is no longer a problem. Another thing is that they tout intermarriage between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim. And many Ashkenazim of the elite will tell you, oh, I have a Mizrahi daughter-in-law and she's a fabulous cook, or she's good looking, etc., etc. But number-wise, actually, at their height, mixed marriages were 28%, and now they're 24%. Because with neoliberal politics, the economic gap in Israel is growing between the haves and have-nots, and the middle class is eroding. So actually, Mizrahim and Ashkenazim have, usually the army was, the compulsory military service was the best boy meet girl, kind of like matchmaker. So now, for many elite Ashkenazim serving in the military is out of fashion. They want to go straight to Silicon Valley. And you can see that many of the fighting units is either Ashkenazi religious zealots from the settlements or Mizrahim as a way to advance. So for secular Mizrahim and secular Ashkenazim, or traditional Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, there are not as many meeting grounds as it used to be because of the insularity of class relations. Almost all of the financial elite is Ashkenazi. But then there is lots of like nostalgia. And the regime uses this nostalgia because nostalgia is a good like numbing pill. Because it's completely unrealistic for Yemeni Jews to go to Yemen right now, right? Or for Egyptian Jews to go to Egypt. But there is this kind of like revival of depoliticized nostalgia. And again, that explains why the Mizrahim are right-wing. Because whenever the right wing is in government, they will give money to cultural projects like that, of reviving nostalgic Arab Jewish culture, as long as these are devoid of politics, of Palestine politics. And then you basically court whomever pays you. So now many Mizrahi leaders are all clapping hands and are very happy with Miri Regev, the new culture minister. She was the IDF minister before, and she is fascist. But she now has a whole board of advisors who's Mizrahim, which is the first time ever a minister of culture has bunch of Mizrahim as advisors, because what do Mizrahim have to do with high culture, right? I mean, it's not like the Israeli Philharmonic to play classical oud music, etc. So many of the Mizrahi activists completely are, and many of whom are pro-Palestine, they're completely quiet on Palestine because the budget is going to come from this fascist minister. And every time Likud was in power, there was a complete renaissance of Arab Jewish culture. When labor is in power, you have like modern dance troops being sent as Hasbara, or the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra, or the Jerusalem Quartet, and so on and so forth. So it's complicated that you do get a renaissance, but there is a political price tag to it. Yes, will you introduce yourself?
How is the condition?
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, Jean Keaton, hi. Thank you for being here. How is the condition of Ashkenazi single moms compare with the Mizrahi single moms?
I discuss it in my book. I was in the welfare lines for 8.5 years. I never met not one, and I'm a head counter, because I'm an empiricist. I've never met not one Ashkenazi of the Achusal variety, of the old-time Ashkenazi. I met some, post-Soviets. But most of the post-Soviet Ashkenazim I met were women who, after Second World War, they were of the Ashkenazi part of the Soviet Union. And after the Second World War, they moved to Dagestan or Kazakhstan. And they always made sure that I write down that they're Ashkenazi, because they were embarrassed waiting in the welfare lines. In my book, I offer a typification of the various kinds of single moms in Israel. And because there is always a fear of Jewish demographics, any kind of mothering is very much encouraged by the regime. And Israel's reproductive technologies are excellent. And it's not a big deal if you can prove your Judaism, like the lineage of 5 generations mothers. It's not a big deal to get your in vitro fertilization paid by the state. Because all of the health care is public. However, the problems start later on when you have the children. So, Ashkenazi single moms get supported by their parents, because they do have intergenerational wealth transmission. Some of it is through the Holocaust reparation money. Some of it is through investment in real estate in the center of Israel that became expensive. And there are many of them. There are many single mothers in Israel on the whole, because women who don't marry, you cannot be a citizen without being a mother. It's part of it's a social requirement to reproduce. And even in first wave feminism that here talked about the motherhood as slavery, Israeli first wave feminists did have this kind of universal equal right deracinated conversation, but never did they question women and motherhood. Mizrahi single mothers don't have funds, so they turn into welfare. And then Ashkenazi single mothers, many of them will not even marry. And I describe in my book this kind of like groups that they have support groups for meeting groups for sperm and ovum donors to meet.
Oh my gosh.
So they can see how they can do co-parenting. And usually it will be a gay couple and a single Ashkenazi mother. And they will parent together. Or it will be a gay couple and a lesbian couple and they parent together. And these support groups are private, and it's one of the ways to screen who goes to this support group. But then they have no problem reproducing, and oftentimes they'll do it so the parents have something that is called in Hebrew nachat, or in Yiddish it's called naches, which is this kind of feeling of grace and love that you have grandchildren. So you call the grandchildren nachat, and everyone wants nachat, and that's a way to provide nachat. And nachat comes with support if you are usually an Ashkenazi.
Okay, thank you very much.
Very welcome. If you want, there are copies of the book. Oh, I forgot the last slide. That's really important. It shows you that I have zero business capabilities. So these are the last 5 copies I have. There are 30 copies available, like through 8 books or whatever. Some people wrote me that they got their books shipped from Amazon India. And yes, I'm amazed that the book sold by now 1,498 copies. For an academic book, it's like a complete miracle.
That's great.
And there's going to be a paperback edition coming in the fall,
Okay.
with which will connect everything. I mean, because I have a model, it's going to be connected to Gaza, 2014 and the present Intifada.
Great.
Sure.